On today's show, the NBA schedule is now out in full force. That includes all 82 games for the Atlanta Hawks. We'll touch on all of the big stuff from the Hawks schedule, the opener, the finale, MLK Day, and much more with details and nuance and all that fun stuff coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1297 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Wednesday evening. It's August 17th, and the NBA schedule is out. So most of today's episode, if not close to all of it, will be about that as it's sort of wall-to-wall coverage time as one of those few events that transpire between the middle of July and training camp. We'll touch on all of that stuff. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered the season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. And as a reminder at the top of the podcast, please subscribe to the Locked On Hawks podcast, where you get your podcasts. And we appreciate everyone's already done that, but please go ahead and do that across platforms, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, as well as YouTube on the video side. And I really do appreciate everyone checking out the podcast already as well, especially in the offseason when it's a little bit of downtime on the show. But as always, we don't really go anywhere. Still multiple times every week, and we're going to be flying through this stuff. So if you're a new listener, welcome aboard and stick with us beyond today. But basically, the schedule we kind of knew was coming out in the near future. I was planning around that, and then earlier this week we got word it was going to be Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. There were little trickles before that. The Christmas Day schedule was at least widely reported before that, which we'll touch on in a second. But essentially, the broad strokes is the Hawks have their schedule in place. It's the full season. A couple years ago, it was first half, second half. Last year, the full 82. This year, the full 82 as well. And the season opener is going to be on October 19th. For the Hawks. That is 4 full days between the end of the preseason, actually, and the regular season opener at home. So a little bit of a lull in between the 4-game exhibition slate for the Hawks and the season opener, which is going to be at home. We'll come back to that in a second. Also, we'll have the Hawks will have 3 games at home to open the season, and then an immediate 5-game road trip to Detroit, who they play twice, actually, then Milwaukee, Toronto, and New York. Just as a general rule in this podcast, most of the show is going to be the sort of top 10 or 10 games to highlight or plan around from the Hawks in sort of a little bit more detail, but I'm going to give you all the broad stroke stuff here at the top of the show. One of the things that was announced actually earlier this week that was more than just beyond the Hawks' purview, that the NBA announced they're actually going to have no games on Election Day in November on a Tuesday. But most of the league, if not all the leagues, going to be playing actually on the day before that, on Monday evening before the election. The Hawks play the Bucks that day before at home on Monday, November 7th. That's a one to keep an eye on for sure. Anytime you play the Bucks, it's a pretty big game if you are the Hawks. Also, just generally speaking, a very tough November for Atlanta. In recent years, the Hawks had some pretty treacherous schedule stuff. We'll come back to that in a second. Actually, it's pretty favorable in a lot of ways for Atlanta this time around, as much as you can sort of guess that in August. I don't want to make too much out of that stuff. It's too early to really plan on difficulty and how things break. But the one real stretch that I sort of circled as a difficult stretch in terms of team quality and opponent quality is in November. The Hawks have a 12-game stretch where they actually play 7 of those 12 games against the top 4 in the East from last year. As a reminder of who that was, it was Boston, it was Milwaukee, it was Miami, and Philadelphia. Plus, in that same stretch, they have a road game in Cleveland, not an easy one necessarily, and then a home game against Toronto. So that 3-week stretch is one to circle for sure from like sort of mid-November till the end of that month. As for Christmas for the Hawks, that was sort of leaking out on Tuesday. Now, of course, official. Actually, it was reported on Monday. Actually, right after I recorded the most recent episode, kind of hilariously, as I was posting it, that kind of came out. I did say on that podcast, I was not expecting the Hawks to play on Christmas if I had to guess, so I'm not surprised. I do understand Hawks fans being frustrated, but there were some other teams I think actually might have had more legit gripes, like the Miami Heat, the number 1 seed last year in the East, conference finalist team. They were within like 1 shot of making the finals last year. No Christmas game for the Miami Heat. Obviously, it'd be more fun for Hawks fans to have a Christmas game. And the Knicks play on Christmas is kind of one of those things. It's sort of a punching bag kind of thing. If you are a Hawks fan, you were definitely wondering why. I think the Knicks, basically, if you look back at the history, they have more Christmas games than any other franchise in the entire NBA. Obviously, the market and the arena have a lot to do with that. Generally speaking, unless the Knicks are projected to be just absolutely terrible, they almost always have Christmas games. And no one thinks the Knicks are going to be awesome this year, myself included. The Hawks are better than the Knicks. No one's saying otherwise, but I was not surprised by that, etc. So obviously a little bit different this time around. No Christmas game for the Hawks. In fact, there's a little bit of a built-in rest time, at least built-in non-game time around that point for Atlanta. I'll go through a lot of games later on, but the Hawks don't play on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, or the day after Christmas. So they have a 3-day break after a home game. That's actually a 3-game home stretch before Christmas, then 3 days off. I'm sure they'll have to practice at some point along the way there. And then they have a quick 1-game trip to Indiana. So a pretty friendly schedule for the players. I know it's always kind of difficult to kind of remember that these guys have families as well. A nice little stretch to get away from the team for the PR guys and the trainers and the coaches, et cetera. A little break in the action at that point in time. Month to month, the home road splits are pretty balanced. There's not anything like crazy out of whack, with the exception of January is the most road heavy month for Atlanta this year. They have 5 home games and they have 10 road games in the month of January. Nothing too crazy in terms of like schedule gauntlets on paper right now. In fact, no month with more than 15 games in it. And that's, of course, averaging like a game every 2 days. It's pretty normal. There are 2 West Coast trips. I was asked the other day, kind of what I was looking for on the schedule more than anything else. It's probably these presence of when the West Coast trips are going to be, how they sort of break down. And the last couple of years, especially last year, I thought the Hawks kind of got off the rails a little bit early in the year with a difficult West Coast road trip. They lost some games there, and that set them back throughout the rest of the season. This time around, the trips are later in the year. It's a 4-game trip to the West Coast to actually begin 2023. It's actually the first 4 games of January. It's the Warriors on the road, then the Kings on the road, and then the back-to-back. Actually, it's 2 games in 3 days in Los Angeles. And then there's a 5-game West Coast trip from January 30th through February 7th in Portland, Phoenix, Utah, Denver, and then New Orleans at the end of that. I'm sort of on the way back. That's the only – actually, there's actually only 2 5-game road trips this season for Atlanta. One of them is right out of the gate. They have the 3 games at home at the beginning of the season, and then the immediate 5-game road trip to Detroit, Milwaukee, Toronto, New York, and the 5-gamer later on. Everything else is shorter than that. No like marathon 6-7 game trips like they used to have in the NBA world. It's actually a pretty home-heavy schedule in the back half of February. In general, the back-to-backs are pretty sparse across the league now. They're trying to have a little bit less of those, of course, with the modern technology and all that fun stuff. But the Hawks have 13 back-to-backs this year. 3 of those are home back-to-backs. A little bit tricky for those of us covering the team going back and forth, but there you go. 4 of them are home-road back-to-backs. Then 3 of them are road-to-home back-to-backs. And the last 3 are back-to-backs with pure travel, road-to-road. So, 10 of those 13 back-to-backs have travel involved in them. That's a little bit tough in some ways, but it's pretty normal with the current schedule across the NBA. In general, though, it's a pretty friendly schedule in terms of rest compared to other teams across the league. There's a site called Positive Residual that does some analysis on schedules across the NBA, and they have the Hawks right now with the 4th easiest schedule in the league when factoring in rest and travel. Some of the travel logistics are difficult to sort of quantify in some ways, but they do a pretty good job with that. Also, the Hawks have 14 games with a rest advantage against their opponent this year. That's actually tied for the most in the entire NBA. So the schedule makers, this could certainly be overblown and undercovered, whatever. I'm not trying to make too much out of it, but there is no like total, unfair gauntlet for the Hawks. It looks like this, if anything, is going to be a little bit favorable to Atlanta schedule-wise this time around. There are actually some precedents of more series in terms of how things break down in the current NBA scheduling process. The Hawks have 3 different ones on the schedule, all on the road. Interestingly enough, they play Detroit twice in a row on the road in October. They play Miami twice in a row on the road in March, and they play Washington twice in a row on the road in March as well. And the league sort of made a big deal out of all of the reduced travel across the league. The estimated average number of miles traveled for each team in the season has been reduced to about 41,000 miles per team. That's actually the record low in the era that actually includes all 30 teams and 82 games. But like a 2,000 mile difference or so from last year. Not a huge difference, but certainly a little bit. And in total, a big difference in terms of 50,000 miles or so traveled less across the league. There's a bunch of stuff like where teams are not traveling between games a lot more often. There are 88 instances of no travel instead of 55 last year in between. So like it's a little bit less challenging, a little bit less taxing, which I think was a point of emphasis for the league at this point in time. Also, to the scheduling point for the Hawks, they get a little bit of a break with who they actually miss in the Eastern Conference. I made sort of a snarky tweet today about, the Hawks playing 30 games against the West, 52 against the East. That's how it always is. There's always 2 games against every team in the West. That's 30 games, and then 52 games against the Eastern Conference. But basically, the Hawks and every team in the East play the majority of the East 4 times each. But there are always a handful of teams that only play 3 times. And this year, it's actually a good selection for the Hawks. So they play every team in the East 4 times except for Boston, Toronto, Cleveland, and Indiana. Now, Indiana is not good. They're rebuilding, so you want to see them as much as possible. But the other 3 teams, especially Boston and Toronto, those are good teams to miss the 4th time. So does that change your life a ton? Maybe not. That might be worth a win along the way somewhere, just not having to play Boston 4 times, not having to play Toronto 4 times, and even Cleveland is a pretty good team on paper as well. Also, sort of last thing, I sort of alluded to this earlier a little bit, but on the day of the 82-game schedule release, it's kind of a minor thing, but the Hawks do not have a preseason home game officially. They confirmed the announcement of their preseason schedule, and it's all the ones that we already had tracked on the podcast. Basically, the Hawks have 3 road games and 1 quote-unquote home game in the preseason, but that home game is actually one of the Abu Dhabi games against the Bucks. That's technically a home and home against Milwaukee, so there is no exhibition game of any kind at State Farm Arena. I'm sure they'll probably have an open practice at some point, but no actual game for the Hawks at home in the preseason. That's not a huge deal, especially when you're traveling across the world to Abu Dhabi, but notable nonetheless. The closest spot for Hawks fans that want to see the team in the preseason is to go to Birmingham, where they'll actually be playing the Pelicans in a road game. So the rest of the show, we'll get into basically me boiling down the schedule to 10 games that Hawks fans can kind of prioritize if they're not like the 82-game full-on playing your life around it kind of diehard, like I have to be in a lot of ways. I'm going to cheat a little bit and not include the opener or the finale, since those are kind of built-in tent poles of the season. So I'll talk about those a little bit as well. But it'll be basically the honorable mentions, as well as the sort of the top 10 or 10 games to highlight on the schedule this year to kind of give you a little bit of a hack. I definitely recommend going through the entire schedule. If you are a diehard, for sure, I'll have, as always, wall-to-wall coverage of all of what's transpiring. But a little bit of a gimmick to get you through the schedule and also highlight some of the must-watch opportunities along the way for the Hawks. But before we get to all of that stuff, a word from our sponsors on today's show. Imagine you're hanging out with some friends and putting back a few drinks in the process, and a few drinks becomes a few too many drinks. And as the evening comes to an end, people start to leave, and you think about calling for a ride, but instead you decide that you live pretty nearby, and you're thinking that it's no big deal, or you can make it home on your own. After all, what are the odds you actually get pulled over for this, especially this close to your house? And even if that happens, what's the worst that could happen? Would your insurance go up, something like that? But also, you could lose your driver's license, or maybe total your car, or honestly worse, you could hurt yourself or even kill yourself or someone else. At this point, everyone should know the risks of driving drunk, and the results are tragic and often deadly. That does not always stop people from getting behind the wheel, though, even if they shouldn't. And that is why police officers are out there looking for people like that right now, impaired drivers on our roads looking to save lives and protect everybody in the process. So if you start to think that it's okay to drive after a few too many drinks, think again, play it safe, and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or the life of someone else forever, and you cannot fix that in the process. So drive sober or get pulled over. All right, and before we get to the top 10 list of the important / highlight-worthy games on the schedule, the season opener for Atlanta is October 19th against the Houston Rockets at home. That's a Wednesday night. The actual NBA opener is the Tuesday doubleheader before that on the 18th. People were sort of asking why the Hawks are playing the Rockets and why it's not like a huge rivalry game after the Hawks, of course, famously played Dallas last year in the opener. I'll just say this. A lot of teams do not have high-profile opening games, especially if they weren't a national TV game. It's a pretty ordinary thing. For example, the Hawks opened the season 2 years ago with a road game in Chicago that was kind of just a normal game. The Wolves weren't supposed to be great that year or anything like that. And then the previous year, it was a game in Detroit that was also kind of just anonymous. So there's also a cool subplot with Houston coming to town because Jabari Smith will be making his NBA debut, top 3 pick. He's also from the Atlanta area. That's a pretty cool little subplot there. And the Rockets are pretty entertaining. Also, for the Hawks standpoint, that's a winnable game. They'll be favoring that game, I'm sure. So not the worst way to start things off on that Wednesday. And then, by the way, the finale, before we get to the actual top 10 list, the season ends on April 9th with a Sunday afternoon game in Boston. It might not mean anything at all. Sometimes that last game of the season can be a little bit weird and meaningless. You're playing backups or whatever, or it can matter a lot. And of course, Boston is going to be very good this year, you would expect. Also, the entire league is playing on that same day. All 30 teams will play in 2 time slots. The whole Eastern Conference plus the one East versus West game will be at 1 o'clock Eastern. And then the 7 games in the West will be at 3:30 Eastern on that day. So it's sort of eliminate some of the gamesmanship stuff we've seen in the past. So the Hawks will be playing. It's a 1 o'clock game on a Sunday in Boston, and we'll see if that game matters at the end of the season. Okay, rather than actually ordering these top 10, I'm going to go in chronological order to kind of keep things clean. If you want to make some notes on these games to sort of highlight. And again, the entire schedule is available now, all 82, and I recommend going even deeper. If you have questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them along the way. But the first game I'm going to mention, again, besides the finale and the opener, etc., is Saturday, October 29th at Milwaukee. It's an 8 o'clock start on a Saturday night in October. This is a pretty obvious game in its appeal. It's a Saturday night. It's a primetime game. It's in Milwaukee. The Bucks are very good. Giannis is very good. And, of course, a rematch from the conference finals 2 years ago. Also, this is the first, pretty true measuring stick game to see, how good the Hawks are. I certainly don't want to overplay that because it's 1 out of 82. I don't want to make too much of that. But the first 5 games for the Hawks are Houston, Orlando, and Charlotte at home, and then 2 games on the road in Detroit. Now, I'm not telling you the Hawks are going to be 5-0 after those 5 games, but they're going to be favored in those 5 games, I think, unless there are injuries, stuff like that. But the 3 games at home and then the 2 games in Detroit, all Charlotte's pretty frisky, et cetera, but the Hawks will be the better team in all 5 of those games. So there's a chance they're undefeated, and this is the first time they'll actually be playing a real opponent on the road. The Bucks are obviously quite good. That would be a very interesting game to kind of circle at that point in time. From there, we're going to go a few weeks ahead to November 16th at home against the Boston Celtics. That's an ESPN game on November 16th. I partially picked this game because it's an ESPN national TV game. It's also a big game in general. But I will say this before I forget to say this from earlier. The Hawks have, at this point in time, 18 national TV games is the way that it actually is described by the league. Now, I will just note this now. It's really 8. There is this sort of the argument between the way the league characterizes national TV and the way that I probably do. 18 is the higher number. That includes 10 NBA TV games. NBA TV is national TV in a lot of ways. There are a lot of markets that have NBA TV, but it's not quite the same as playing on ABC or TNT or ESPN. By the way, zero ABC games right now for the Hawks, but they have some TNT. There's 3 games there and 5 games on ESPN. But 18, if you want to say that, and out of market, noteworthy as well. Anyway, that's a big game in general. Beyond the ESPN appeal of that game, Boston, as I mentioned before, is the betting favorite, actually, to be the number 1 team in the East. And they won the East last year, of course. They're actually better on paper now than they were then because they got Malcolm Brogdon. Also, as a throw-in here, it's the return of Gallo to Atlanta, which is a little bit of extra juice there after a couple of years with the Hawks. He was on that conference finals team, et cetera. And the first of a few different returns that we'll highlight in this space. But in general, November, as I mentioned before, is a tough month for the Hawks. It's a tough game for sure, but it's at home. It's winnable for Atlanta. It's a high-profile game, good atmosphere. The Hawks and Celtics, honestly, if you ask me who the number 1 rival is for the Hawks, it's probably still the Celtics. They don't have a huge built-in rival, but for fans of a certain age, like myself or older, Boston's always been the team that I would say is probably the Hawks' biggest rival. So all that said, that's a big game, of course, pretty obviously. So from there, the third game that I'll highlight is the Kevin Huerter return game on November 23rd. So on paper, a home game against Sacramento on a Wednesday would not qualify for the list, but obviously the Huerter stuff makes it more interesting in a lot of ways. As I noted before, Gallinari, et cetera, Huerter's not the only player that left the Hawks in the offseason, but he was a first-round pick from the organization that they developed in-house and extended. He was a key piece for 4 years, et cetera. So it's more notable than a typical return game. From a diehard aspect, also this is Justin Holiday and Mo Harkless playing against their old team. The Kings have Alex Len on the team, etc. And also, just generally speaking, as an NBA person, the Kings are pretty interesting to me. Not in a fantastic way, but they're sort of team building stuff. That's an interesting roster in a lot of ways. The Hawks should be favored in that game as well. It was probably the least appealing of the 10 games, but I wanted to at least highlight Huerter, and that was the next one on the agenda. Again, that's Wednesday, November 23rd. From there, the fourth game is Wednesday, December 7th, so a few weeks ahead, at Madison Square Garden. It's an ESPN game against the Knicks, of course. And every time the Hawks go to MSG with Trae Young on the roster, it's definitely an event to be covered. And this is a national TV game as well, of course, with ESPN on the scene. So extra eyeballs, extra attention, extra buildup, etc. Technically, the Hawks go to New York before this, actually. They actually go to MSG on November 2nd. That's not a national TV game, though, so I'm gonna pick the split the difference and take the national game for more, I guess, exposure and all that stuff. But I will say the Knicks also have playoff aspirations, and New York is a team that the Hawks could be battling with in the standings, especially if the Knicks were to get Donovan Mitchell in the next few weeks, or at least between now and December. That would even increase the watchability of that contest. But obviously, the Hawks and Knicks have a little bit of a rivalry going following the playoff series 2 years ago. Trey versus Knicks fans, of course, is still a thing at this stage. So that's one to circle for sure. And again, an ESPN game on December 7th. From there, the fifth game is actually a month beyond that. So we go from December 7th to January 8th, and that is a Sunday game in Los Angeles against the Los Angeles Clippers, not the Lakers. So this is probably the least sexy game that I chose, but it's an opportunity to highlight the entire stretch. It's basically this one and the Kings game. They're not the sexiest ones, but the Hawks have that 4-game West Coast trip to open January. This is the last game after playing Golden State, Sacramento, and the Lakers in that order. But this is the Sunday night primetime game after staying in LA the night before. Crucially, you never know how that's going to go with a young team necessarily having to sort of stay over in LA for a full off day on Saturday. But I personally think the Clippers are going to be pretty awesome this year. If Kawhi is Kawhi, that's a huge question mark. But Kawhi and PG, plus it's possible on paper, if Clippers are going to be as good as I think they possibly could be, this might be their toughest game of the season, or at least one of them on the road, because anytime you have to go across the country at the end of a road trip, crucially, and especially the end of a West Coast road trip, and play an awesome team, if they are indeed locked in with Kawhi and PG, etc., that'll be a difficult task and also a pretty interesting game on a Sunday evening. Okay, before we get to the rest of the list, and there is more, I assure you, 5 more games to touch on, plus some honorable mentions, etc. A word from our sponsors on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline, and BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to check out all of your sports betting needs, both now and always. Find all of your favorite sports and events at #1 source for online odds, lines, and games, with a ton of future-facing action on the site. With future football season, of course, is fast approaching at this point. Preseason is already here, and everyone loves football, to be honest with you. So there you go on that. Also, there's a ton of future-facing stuff on the site that includes future odds in the NBA, as well as baseball with the World Series looming in October, NHL, combat sports, esports, soccer, golf, tennis, auto racing, horse racing, rugby, entertainment bets, and much more. BetOnline is the #1 source as well for all the wagering information that you are looking for. That includes live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts, and they have you covered across the board. They also have casino games. They have poker and other ways to get on the action today. Head to BetOnline right now on your mobile device or your computer. Check out more about all of the trends and the action happening today in the sports world. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, and the list rolls on here with the 6th game that I'll highlight, and this is one that's very obvious. Perhaps the most high-profile game of the season for Atlanta and this market is the MLK Day on Monday, January 16th against the Miami Heat. It's a TNT game. That's crucial. At home, State Farm Arena. It's a 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time tip-off, kind of a prime game there on a Monday holiday. Also a playoff rematch, of course, part of the appeal there. Miami should be good again, competitive game, etc. And for some background here, I got some. I'm not trying to pick on anybody. People don't necessarily know all this stuff. The Hawks have been hosting MLK Day games regularly for a long time. In fact, basically almost always since 1994, they've had a game at home on MLK Day. There are 3 exceptions. In 90 and 98, the Hawks were playing that whole season between Georgia Tech's campus and the Georgia Dome when they were building the arena that's now there, and they couldn't play on that day. 1999, there were no games played that day due to the lockout. And then 2017 was the one that bothers everybody, including me. The Hawks just got snubbed that year for whatever reason. The Hawks were not happy about that at all. The Hawks were also pretty good then. The previous year, they were really good. That year, as I've said a lot, was not a lot of fun. That was the Dwight Howard season, 2016-17. But they made the playoffs. They weren't a terrible team by any means. And I'm not sure what the deal was there. I don't think anybody really knows. But anyway, that game happened. That game did not happen the way that you would think. But generally speaking, the Hawks always have a game on MLK Day. It's a great national landscape. They have often done the choir intros, etc. Sometimes it's an NBA TV game, like sort of early in the day if the Hawks are not very good. But when the Hawks are good, Atlanta is usually in a national TV slot, which is the case this year as well with the TNT game against Miami. Last year it was Bucks Hawks on TNT, rematch conference finals, etc. So that'll be a lot of fun. And of course, the playoff stuff, etc. That'll be a headline grabbing game on Monday, January 16th. The 7th game is actually 2 days later, the closest that I have any of these to each other. But there's an obvious reason. It's because the Hawks play on the road in Dallas on Wednesday, January the 18th. And I think there's still a lot of attention on any matchup between the Hawks and the Mavericks. And this one is the first of the 2 matchups. It's also an ESPN game. It's right after MLK Day. So a lot of national exposure for the Hawks that week, which is pretty interesting in itself. And Dallas has not come to Atlanta until April. And April games are often kind of a mess. So I'm choosing the one that's more interesting and more safe to be interesting at this point in time. I do think that there's a little bit less buzz for every single Luka Trey game now in year 5 than there was early on for obvious reasons. But it's obviously, we're all rooting for those guys to play against each other and have a lot of fun doing that. Also, Tim Hardaway Jr. is a former Hawk on the Mavericks roster. And beyond all the buzz that just kind of built in with Trey and Luka, it's a road test on the road against a team that's really good. This is a conference finals team from last year, the Mavericks are. So that'll be an interesting game. Even though it's midweek, it's an ESPN one, so highlight that one. The 8th game is Wednesday, February 1st at Phoenix. Also an ESPN game. So 2 weeks after the Dallas game is at Phoenix. Not a rivalry or anything like that with the Suns, but the Hawks and Suns have played some interesting games in the last couple of years. Phoenix had the dreadful playoff performance and playoff exit last year to Dallas, actually, but they were the number 1 team in the league by a pretty wide margin in the regular season, so they're still very good. They're bringing the band back after bringing back DeAndre Ayton and Booker and Paul and Bridges, etc. It's a late tip, by the way, a 10 p.m. Eastern time game, so it's really the only late game on the entire list here, and I'm sure a lot of people have to go to bed. I do understand that, but it's a game that's in the middle of a stretch with the Blazers, the Nuggets, the Jazz, etc. on the road, and I'll be fascinated to see how the Hawks handle that game against a very good team in Phoenix. 6 days later, the Hawks play a TNT game, one of their only 3 of the season. They play the New Orleans Pelicans on Tuesday, February 7th, TNT. It's right before the All-Star break in a lot of ways. It's TNT Showcase. New Orleans is a very weird team that could be just awesome if Zion is back in full force to join forces with guys like Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum and Herb Jones, etc. Or it might go south, and you might be like, why is this game on national television? Because the Pelicans might just be okay again. So we'll see. But the Pelicans should be pretty good. It's on the road, national TV game. Also, it's kind of in that dead zone between the NFL championship games and the Super Bowl. So there's kind of like a ramp up to NBA stuff at that point in the schedule, pre-NCAA tournament, etc. So that's one to circle on your calendars. And then number 10 on the list is the Golden State Warriors coming to Atlanta on March 17th. This is a very obvious one in a lot of ways, although it is in the middle of the NCAA tournament. So if you are a college basketball person, maybe this will pass you by. But if you're an NBA diehard, having the champs come to town is usually a good way to draw attention. That's also the last one, again, in chronological order. But quality in play dips a little bit in March and April in general across the NBA world a lot of times. So that's why there's only one game after like mid-February on this list that I'm making. But the reigning champs, it's a Friday night game. Probably be a lot of buzz in that building that night. NBA TV will have the broadcast as well outside the Atlanta market, and the Warriors should be quite good again. Of course, they have Steph and Clay and Draymond, another season of Kuminga and Moody and Wiseman, etc. So that'll be a lot of interest in that one. Let's just say. I say this all the time, but the best game I've ever attended in the regular season was the Hawks-Warriors game in 2015 at home. It may not be as good as that one, but the Warriors come to town. It's always very interesting, and they will bring their rings with them, I am sure. Okay, with that 10-game list out of the way, I will just list off some honorable mentions that made the cut, that didn't quite make the cut, but will still be of interest. One of them is October 21st in Atlanta. The Hawks play the Magic, which is normally a pretty boring game, but Chris Haynes reported this one a couple of days ago, and it's because it is the first meeting between DeJounte Murray and Paolo Banchero after their Pro-Am dust-up earlier this summer. I talked about that a little bit with Andrew Kelly. Not really my beat necessarily, but apparently Murray and Banchero have some highly anticipation because it was reported by a national outlet a day and a half early. So circle that one, October 21st in Atlanta. Also, October 31st, a.k.a. Halloween, Saturday night in Toronto. I'm including this one. It's close to the Milwaukee game that I mentioned before, but Toronto is the team that is most often placed in the same tier as the Hawks in the East. It's generally speaking seen as like a top 4 and then kind of a 5-6 with Toronto and Atlanta in some order from some of the projections that I've seen. It's a road game. Toronto's a tough place to play. Interesting playing style, versatility, etc. A nice little test for the Hawks on Halloween. December 11th at home against Chicago is an interesting one because it's right into a back-to-back with Memphis on the road. That's a tough back-to-back. The Bulls are a high-profile team. I love Sunday night home games. That'll be an odd time. It's a 6:30 p.m. start, etc. Memphis is fun as well. December 30th, the last game of the year for Atlanta in 2022 is the Lakers coming to town on the 30th. The Lakers were brutal last year. I get that, but there's always buzz when they come to town. Lots of Lakers fans, I'm sure, will be in the building that day, especially if LeBron and AD are in attendance. I had to do this for my own self, but DeLon Wright comes back to Atlanta on February 28th as a member of the Wizards. This is pretty crazy. The Wizards and Hawks, as division foes, play 4 times this year. The first game between the two teams is on February the 28th. That's insane. They play 4 games after February 28th. That's weird scheduling, but alas, here we are. And the first one's at home. It's the line right. It's tribute video season, etc. And also could matter if Washington's playing well, as they are potentially a fringe playoff contender. And then finally, the home finale. I mentioned before the actual season finale is the April 9th game in Boston, but the Hawks play at home on April 7th against Philadelphia. And that's a big game potentially because the Sixers are going to be good this year, obviously, with Embiid and Harden and Maxey, etc. And a nice little test to end the season for the Hawks before hopefully a playoff run commences. At any rate, that's my rundown. I think I mentioned like 17 or 18 games along the way there, but sort of a prime 10, and then honorable mentions, openers, finales, etc. And I'm sure I'll talk about every game along the way. In fact, I know I will. But that's kind of the overview right now and stuff to look for on the schedule. Last thing before we get out of here on this Wednesday, I get this podcast posted for everybody. It's been asking when it's coming. There was an interesting launch. It's not really a Hawks-related thing on the court, so usually I would not do this. But I think it was interesting enough to Hawks fans who I know I've always hear from frustrations about Hawks fans who can't watch the Hawks or it's difficult to watch the Hawks. I don't usually cover a ton of broadcast stuff here, but I'm a giant sports media nerd. So on Wednesday, Sinclair, which owns Bally Sports Networks, made an announcement that could affect some Hawks fans if they would like it to. It's very important here. No one's making you do this. It's more of an add-on option for you. But on September 26th, Sinclair is launching Bally Sports South. Bally Sports Plus for South and Southeast. Basically, across 19 markets, there's been a soft launch before this in a few local areas that were not included at Lamb. Now they're rolling it out nationwide. 19 markets that includes Bally Sports South and Southeast, which are the 2 Hawks markets. It is available for $19.99 a month or $190 a year. That's a lot of money. I get that. I'm only going to talk about this for the Bally Sports South and Southeast stuff because of the purposes of being tied to the Hawks, obviously. But almost every game of the season for the Hawks is carried on Bally, with only a few exceptions for certain national TV games, your ABC games, etc. But Sinclair has not had agreements with streaming services for a little while now. YouTube TV does not have Bally. Hulu does not have Bally, etc. In fact, I believe the only streaming service, I want to be clear about that, streaming service that actually has Bally Sports South and Southeast is DirecTV Stream. Or, of course, you can have the cable package like I do with Xfinity or Charter, whoever you have. But I know a lot of people are cutting the cord, etc. As an alternative, if you do not have access to Bally via cable for money reasons or something like that, Bally is having this service to give people the option to pay sort of a la carte for their services in the Southeast. Now, this has to be in the markets. If you're an out-of-market listener, this does not apply to you. But the advantage there is that if you're out of market, you can actually still buy League Pass and watch the Hawks. People are confused by this. If you live outside of the Atlanta footprint, you could just watch the Hawks on League Pass. It's really easy. But if you're in Atlanta and don't have Bally, then you are in some trouble. So you have to either find a way to get Bally or something like that. So anyway, this is an option for people to pay for Hawks coverage. In some markets, it would also include NBA, NHL, or even baseball teams. But Atlanta does not have an NHL team at this point in time. There are only 5 teams that have baseball agreements to actually have streaming stuff on there for Bally, and that does not include the Braves. So the majority of the investment right now, if you were to get Bally Sports Southeast and Plus and all that stuff, is to be having Hawks games, which is, for me, it'd be worth it if the investment in the Hawks, but I get why you wouldn't do that. I'm not telling you what to do, but it's not super cheap to do this. It is essentially targeted people that have only cable or DirecTV stream. And if you just watch sports and you don't want to have Hallmark Channel or Sci-Fi or whatever on your bundle, it's probably cheaper to have this, etc. If you want to keep your cable or DirecTV, nothing changes. That's important to note as well. But League Pass, again, not an option if you live in Atlanta. So this is a way that if you basically wanted to have no other TV option and just get Hawk stuff, you could do that with this offering. I also if you have the your typical cable package like I do, the Bally Sports app should still work for you with the login through your cable provider like you've been doing previously if you want to. I have a feeling that a lot of fans might wait on this until the Braves, or I guess maybe if the Braves are ever included in it, and they're not right now. So if you wanted both Hawks and Braves, you still have to have cable or DirecTV stream. But that happened Wednesday. There were lots of questions about it, especially about the price point, et cetera, whether you had to be in Atlanta. But no NHL team, no Braves stuff. So really for Bally Sports South and Southeast, it's mostly Hawk stuff. You get other stuff too, but there's no soccer on there, Atlanta United, et cetera. It's only what Sinclair has the rights to. And that's where we are right now. If you are a diehard Hawks fan, that might be an option for you at this stage. Okay, that'll be it for today's podcast. If you missed it earlier in the week, I had a mailbag show on Monday. And previously, I talked to Andrew Kelly for a multiple-part episode. I talked to Bill DeFilippo earlier this month as well. Tyler Jones, Robbie Callan, etc. It's been very busy on the show, even in the offseason. I'm still doing like 3, maybe even 4 shows a week at this stage. And we'll be back to 4 or 5, probably even maybe 6 sometimes during the season very, very soon. But please subscribe to the podcast. Tell a friend about the show as well. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland if you'd like to. Follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. And I really do beg you to share this with a friend. If you have a Hawks fan friend in your life that's not found the podcast, tell them about it. If they hate it, that's okay. But have them check it out at some point in time and leave a 5-star rating, review, etc. Thank you for listening, everybody. And we'll see you later on this week.